Hi guys, so Jonathan Ashworth, who is the Shadow Secretary for Health, clashed with Matt Hancock in Parliament on funding for the NHS. So let's hear what both of them had to say.
Everybody knows that the NHS went into this crisis after years of underfunding. Everybody knows that the NHS went into this crisis with capital budgets having been repeatedly raided which has left hospitals with a £6 billion repair bill. The NHS entered this crisis after cuts to around 15,000 beds have been cut since 2010 in the National Health Service. We've entered this. Of course, we'll give way.
So he's going to give way to Matt Hancock. But before Matt Hancock speaks, I think it's very important to look at the data. So this is from Full Fact. It's a fact-checking website about, in this case, we're going to look at funding for the NHS. Now, this is NHS England. The other NHSs are not included in this data. But the questions that the issues that they're discussing is, of course, NHS England. Now, if you look at the budgeting over the last 10 years, it says here it's about 119 billion back in 2010, 2011, and it rose up to about 133 billion in 2019. Of course, 2020 is excluded. 2020 is, of course, a particular year. But if you look at this graph, you can see quite clearly that funding gradually increased. It's not a dramatic increase, but it is an increase. Now, the problem with this data or this graph is that while the funding increased slightly, the population of the UK increased a bit more dramatically. So if we look here at the population back in 2010 was 62,759,500 people. The population, this only goes up to about 2017. After that, there are estimates. Well, let's look at 2017. So 2017, there were 66,040,200 people. So about 3 million more people were added to the population. Now, that's important to remember. Now, if we look at actually how the Tories' funding compares to other governments, I think that's very important. If we look down here at this graph, it shows here that funding between, for example, 2010 and 2000 and 2010, at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, we can see a large increase in spending, and then it sort of declines somewhat. Now, how does this match with the actual governments at the time? So we can see here changes in UK public spending on health. Now, this is in relation to gross domestic product. Thatcher was about 3% of GDP. John Major's government spent about 5% of GDP on public health. Tony Blair's government spent about 6.5% or almost 7%. Gordon Brown's government spent about the same as John Major's, about 5%. And then we see down here the coalition government. Now, the coalition government was the Conservatives in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. They spent about 1% of GDP on public health. This increased slightly to about the same level as Margaret Thatcher's, which was about 3% under David Cameron's government. So you can see here that what the Shadow Secretary is saying about how public funding has been cut, he's telling the truth here. The spending in relation to GDP is much lower. Now, that's extremely concerning because as the population increases, public spending per GDP should increase as well. But instead, under the coalition government, it decreased dramatically, and under David Cameron's government, up to just a few years ago, it was still pretty low, at the same level as Margaret Thatcher. But the population since then has dramatically increased. For example, Margaret Thatcher, until 1989, let's look at the UK population. In 1989, 1989 was 57 million people, while almost 10 million so you're looking at 10 million more people are in the population requesting public services, requesting health services. The population has increased by 10 million, but the spending per GDP is pretty much the same. So this, in real terms, is a cut.
We can't let this stand. What a load of nonsense. The NHS went into this crisis with the highest funding level in its history, with more...
Yes, it went. So that's what he's saying is technically correct. The funding increased, but it's not in relation to GDP and not in relation to the population.
Doctors than any time in its history, with more nurses than at any time in its history, with the biggest hospital building programme in its history. The investment from this...
Is he talking about the 40 hospitals that Boris Johnson promised that have suddenly disappeared? Remember the promise that Boris Johnson was talking about building, was it 40 or 44? I've already forgotten. Well, how many of those 40 or 44 hospitals have actually been built or even started or even have been put into planning? It seems to be pretty much zero.
This government in this NHS is the highest that has ever been made by any British government in history, and that's why it's only us who are the party of the NHS.
How Matt Hancock can say we're the party of the NHS when they're actually planning to sell it off. Take some brass, you-know-what.
The National Health Service has been systematically underfunded for years under this Tory government, and the NHS went into this crisis without adequate levels of PPE for frontline staff, with nurses using curtains and plastic bags to protect themselves on the wards in the face of this.
How can Matt Hancock smile here? He knows fully well that members of staff had to wear plastic bags because there was no PPE available. Why was there no PPE available? Because the government didn't bother to invest the money required to purchase new PPE, to upgrade PPE. A lot of PPE was out of date. A lot of it could not be used. A lot of it was inaccurate for the purpose necessary. And for Matt Hancock, this is all a joke.
Horrific virus. They're sighing. They sent our staff into the face of danger without the proper protection. That's what happened into this crisis because of years of cutbacks and underfunding in the National Health Service. Cutbacks and underfunding, which meant we've lost 15,000 beds in the National Health Service since 2010. Cutbacks which meant that our public health budgets have been cut by 800 million under this Tory government because of years of austerity in the NHS. We've got people with serious...
I think this is very important to remember. Austerity is about cutting services for people who need those services. Austerity is about cutting money for the poor, for the working class. Austerity is always inflicted upon the poor and the working class. It's never inflicted upon the rich or the well-to-do. Politicians will always be fine. They will understand what it's like. They'll never understand what it's like to feel austerity, to be at the sharp end of austerity. They will be cushioned from it. They will be well cocooned from any pain or suffering that goes along with austerity.
Mental health problems, who will be spending this lockdown in Victorian-style mental health dormitory wards because of the cutbacks to capital funding over here. That is absolutely true.
The honourable gentleman mentioned...
The honourable gentleman. Now, Matt Hancock is going to spin the usual lie here, or not lie, but extension of the truth, or bending of the truth here.
Dormitories in mental health services. Dormitories have plagued mental health services for years and years and years. And which is the first government that has not only committed but put the funding in to end dormitories in mental health services? This Conservative government. It isn't only that this government is the government for the NHS.
Why are you saying we're putting in the funding to... How long does it take to end these dormitories? What can you present to us to see that you are actually doing what you're saying? This is typical of Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock and other ministers. They will say, we've spent 100 million on this project, or we've spent 100,000 pounds on this, or 100 million on this, or 100 billion on this. It's irrelevant how much money you're spending if it doesn't show anything. What are the results of the money invested?
NHS, and we're the party of the NHS. We are the party investing record sums into mental health services, with the biggest increase of all the increases in funding going into mental health services, including ending the dormitories in mental health services that have existed ever since the NHS was created.
But what evidence can you present that you have ended any of these dormitories?
We've been cutting capital budgets in the NHS, which is why we've still got these horrendous dormitory wars at Leicestershire Trust, Derbyshire Trust, and for years because of Tory cutbacks, we have had CCGs raiding the budgets of child and adolescent mental health budgets in order to fix the wider revenue gaps in the NHS. That is because of 10 years of underfunding in the National Health Service, and we went into this crisis with an NHS which didn't have enough staff, short of 80,000 staff in the NHS, which has seen 15,000 beds cut, which has seen public health budgets cut by 800 million, which has left hospitals with £6 billion worth of repair bills, with dormitories in these Victorian wards which haven't been updated for years. He cannot stand there and say that the NHS had enough investment going into this crisis, because if it had, we wouldn't have had staff without the PPE.
And he's correct. You wouldn't have had staff without the PPE. You wouldn't have staff going out and buying the PPE themselves. You wouldn't have had doctors ordering it online from China because they weren't able to source it locally. And you wouldn't have had a government handing out contracts to private companies who had no business with developing or creating PPE. But that was the case. That was what happened. Matt Hancock and his government handed out contracts to private companies who, I don't know, did they have some sort of connection with the Conservative Party? Did they fund the Conservative Party? Did they give donations? What was the connection between these companies who had no competences when it came to PPE, were handed contracts to produce PPE? I think it's very important, guys, to remember that the NHS is not receiving the funding it needs. The NHS funding should increase with inflation, it should increase with the population, it should increase with GDP. More and more money should be invested in the NHS. This pandemic demonstrates that. Unfortunately, what's happening under this government is that they're investing money in the NHS, but where that money goes isn't always to frontline services, it's not always to purchase, for example, PPE. It's handed over to middlemen and they squander that money. Normally, middlemen being private companies, Serco being an example. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?